Okay, we start in prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I actually should have been telling people about this for a few classes back, but April 17th, which is a Tuesday, and usually we do, I think that's usually Heresy, the Catechism of Catholic Prayer. We usually do that, Tuesdays at 5. But April 17th at 7 o'clock, we have a rare instance to see both one of my former professors and someone who has something to say for one of the classes. His name's Father Emmanuel Katongole. He teaches at Duke. I got to take classes with him. He's an African priest. He's from Uganda. He teaches a lot about reconciliation in Uganda, Rwanda, and some of the difficulties that Africa has gone through. And so instead of teaching the chapter on African martyrs myself, I said, well, there's someone else who could talk about those sort of issues a lot better than I can. So we're switching things around. So if you want to go at Newman University, April 17th at 7 o'clock to hear Father Katongole talk about reconciliation in Africa, many of the themes that we've been talking about in 20th century martyrs, he'll bring up, and I think it will be a perfect instance to hear him talk. And conversely, we have to move Heresy, the Catechism of Catholic Prayer to the Thursday should be on, so there's a little bit of schedule switching. This class happens to be one that I don't think will switch at all, so of course it would be the class that I first mentioned it, because it makes no sense to do so, but there you go, if it's a neat opportunity if you want to get to. Today, I thought it was good going into Triduum to talk about vainglory. And vainglory, of course, being the vice that is opposite of humility. Now, many people, this usually gets rendered as pride. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, pride usually is used in a larger, and it's actually used in all sorts of senses. And so, at least for Thomas, he usually says vainglory. And then humility is its opposing virtue. And then the neurosis, as he's been commonly saying, is what he calls, I'll wait till I get there, but I always mess it up, pusillanimity, which, yes, might be the etymology of where we get a certain word some of you were smirking about. It'll all make sense in a bit. When we start to think about pride, like I said, going into starting with the Last Supper, Jesus being arrested today, Good Friday where Jesus, of course, is punished and dies, and then waiting on Holy Saturday for the resurrection of Jesus, vainglory and humility are good things to think about. So I thought this works out as something to listen to as we go into Triduum today. But when it comes to pride, and if interpreting vainglory as pride, or talking about pride, pride's always one of these words, sort of like wrath in a bit of a way. If you'll remember, we said wrath was the only word in the Bible, the only 7 deadly sins where it seems like we attribute wrath to God. And so we were more specific about what wrath must mean. And in the same way, proud, when we say people are proud, we can either invoke the devil in, Paradise Lost, being too proud to bend the knee and saying non servum and, going and tempting an Adam and Eve, or we can think about something like John Zmirak brings up. We say a mother holding her newborn baby is proud, and that we say that the little kid is adorable. And if you're one of those people that, as Zmirak points out, should be slapped in the face, who wants to quibble over everything, you could, I suppose, act like in some way a mom who is glowing over her new baby in pride should be, related to the devil. You'd just be a horrible person. Or, you could say if someone says, oh, that child's adorable, you could be that person who's like, oh, are you going to fall down and worship it and light a candle? Which, of course, would all be silly misunderstandings of the word. Same thing with, the Marines, the few, the proud, the Marines. Smirek brings up, it's sort of hard to imagine the devil and all of his minions willingly going through boot camp with St. Michael, yelling at them, "You devils!" It doesn't seem like that would work out. So what do we mean when we say the pride of a warrior and the pride of Satan? Then he points out in our day and age we have pride being the sort of tack on to any sort of group identity. Black pride, white pride, gay pride, owners of small dog pride, whatever we might have. It seems to be one of those things that we throw out there. John Smirek says if you want to be, fun and get kicked out of school, you can repeat what they did in the 90s, and they would do the similar thing that they use all the rest of the 7 deadly sins. So they'd have like gay sloth and white lust and black envy, and they said, it really would just make people really mad. So he doesn't really suggest doing it. But you start to see how we use pride in all sorts of strange ways, and St. Thomas wants us to be very specific, because there's all sorts of, I remember my dad always said, you need to take pride in what you do, and there was this idea of caring enough to make sure something was done well. And I remember getting in arguments, but Dad, pride is the source of all sin. And so, yet again, English doesn't lend itself well to being specific. So St. Thomas wants to throw a bit of particularity into some of these things that we're saying to make more sense of what we're talking about today. So, one way he talks about superbia. Sounds like suburbia, but it's superbia. Superbia is the outsized, metastasizing self-love and willfulness we associate with 2-year-olds and the devil. St. Thomas saw this as the dark tendency in the soul as the root of every evil. So if you want to say pride is the root of all evil, what we're talking about specifically is superbia. This sort of idea to flaunt against God when clearly we don't belong in even the same discussion group as God. And so actually, below all of the 7 deadly sins is superbia, according to Thomas. And it's just this very basic idea that we are better than we really are, and it tempts us to do all the other things in contradistinction to God. So when we say the devil is proud, we usually mean superbia. We're not going to call a mother who's proud of her new baby, suburbial. I don't know, you guys practice that. Call someone superbial today and see what happens. Then there comes the actual quite opposite of this, the magnanimity. I'm not going to write it down. I would screw it up. It's the Latin word for magnanimity. I always mess this one up. And we don't talk about this word anymore. For Aristotle, it means greatness of soul, the magnanimous man. And usually when you have someone like a mother that's proud of her child, or your dad says, take pride in your work, what they mean is to have magnanimity about what you have just done. We display this when accepting proportionate praise for a job well done. So, the mother who holds the child in her hand has every reason to beam, because I've seen it myself, childbirth is hard work. If someone has the right sort of appreciation of what they've done as a craftsman, or teachers as they sit and watch their students graduate every May, this is magnanimity and not superbia. And so it's okay and not only good, but it's actually wrong not to be magnanimous. So, refusing to take any credit for good deeds we've done is this, the sort of Christian, Smirek says, the sort of Christian one would gladly feed to the lions, except that it would make the lion sick, is actually wrong and not to be done. St. Thomas' term for this condition is, and then I'll write it down finally. Pusillanimity. Pusillanimous. Please call people this more often. Pusillanimous. And pusillanimous, in some ways that means cowardly, but in a more fuller sense, it is this absence of wanting to do things well for all sorts of reasons, for fear, for false humility, etc. So humility is what we're striving for, vainglory, what we're trying to avoid. Pusillanimity is the neuroses. Vainglory is the better definition because it too fits under the more broad definition of pride, in which we need to separate out sort of terms. So like we said, superbia is the sort of demonic pride that instills rebellion in us. Magnanimity is the sort of happiness, proportionate happiness we take in a job well done. And vainglory, which vana gloria in Latin, as Thomas calls it, is the deadly sin that is its own deal instead of the superbia that underlines all faults. Vainglory is a good way to put it. We are literally proud of nothing, or proud of nothingness. We're proud of something that we don't deserve. We're proud in a way that does not merit the glory that we want to attach to it. It is this tendency St. Thomas listed as one of the 7 deadly sins, and he no doubt saw plenty of it in his day, as Zmirak puts it. Feudal lords who vaunted the lands they inherited as if they laid the tectonic plates themselves, ladies whose fleeting beauty turned them into tyrants, and mystics who used the revelations as means of wielding power or making money. In other words, nothing has changed in 700 years. Sorry, pretty good one, basically. C.S. Lewis did a good job of defining humility when he summed it up as honesty applied to the self. And underlying all of these sort of discussions is a sort of assessment that we make about ourselves. We've talked about this with the 7 deadly sins in general. This idea of assessment and how that works has pervaded all of these things. And so vainglory is to assess ourselves incorrectly, and humility is to be honest about who we really are. All of which is to say that the vice opposed to humility is vainglory, that it is glorying in nothing that we really should glory about. And then, as John Zmirak says, various people do a good job of this. He goes on a diatribe against New York City as the hybrid of vainglory. He says, everywhere you meet, someone is just a failed actor or a failed Broadway producer or a failed, opera singer at the Met, a failed artist. I think that he was just talking about people like me who've been around colleges too long, right? All of us are just failed geniuses. Well, we're not failed geniuses, right? We're geniuses that are just waiting around to be noticed. And this happens a lot in sort of college-type atmospheres. So he says, the not-so-worse kind are the people who realize that they're failed, whatever they call them, but it's always someone else's fault. I would have been a great rock and roll artist, but I couldn't find band members I could trust to come for practice every day. So instead, now I am a middle manager at Best Buy, and I play gigs at the side for my Kiss cover band, or whatever it might be. There's this sort of vainglory that is almost a nostalgia. And nostalgia has a lot of vainglory about it, in its worst forms. I could have been something, the dice didn't roll my way, but in reality, I am that thing that never happened. So it's vainglory in a stunningly well-put demonstration, to be proud of something that never had of the shoulda, coulda, woulda sort of pride that we like to take in ourselves. So, anybody watch Napoleon Dynamite and seen Uncle Rico? The guy who's 40 years old now, who said if he would have just been put in during the state championship game, they would have won, and he would have gone on to play college football. Vainglory. Glorying in yourself in a way that it can do no good. Smirak points out, though, that there's even worse, as far as delusional wise go, vainglory, where people act like they're something they are ostensibly not at all. So they're the people who haven't realized that they've failed, he says, and so he starts naming off friends he's had. So like the sculptor he knew that hadn't sculpted in 7 years, who works as a tour guide but introduces himself as an artist. He's friends with an opera singer who never made it past the chorus, who flounced off stage complaining about misogyny but calls herself a former diva. A Catholic journalist whose principled refusal to work lost him over time several primo apartments. He couldn't believe they expected him to pay rent. And most of his front teeth. He's planned for 25 years to personally refound the Jesuits. He had an Irish-American friend who was violently alcoholic and fancied himself as a Sinn Féin freedom fighter, but he'd never been to Ireland. The chief who got booted from kitchen to kitchen, and he explains the reason no one likes his food is because they're not sophisticated enough. A therapist who plans to form a private Catholic army to go combat the global sex trade using martial arts. So, yeah.
I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, no, these are just bullet points of friends he's mentioned that are great examples, he says, of like delusional vainglory. And of course, Smirak always has a story and he meets crazy people, but I think we all sort of know this. There's been plenty of novels written about this fact. We want to just assume that it's some sort of delusion or near mental disease, but you see how easily that vainglory becomes deadly. It makes us imagine a world that has no purchase with reality. And of course, reality is always where God is meeting us. God is meeting us here. He's meeting us today. He's not meeting us tomorrow when we will be, an opera singer or the Prince of Persia. He's talking to us now, just like he's not talking to us in the past. God isn't back then when I could have been the high school star quarterback or wrote that great idea if only Breaking Bad didn't steal the idea, or whatever we might come up with. Vainglory allows us to be delusional, yes, in silly ways, but oftentimes in very small, subtle ways that we're all too familiar with. When we want to assess our relationship to significant others, to family members, to our plans, is it easier for us to imagine a vain version of ourselves to put forth to the world and be happy about it, rather than deal with the world here and now and all of its good and its bads? So, putting that in mind and keeping like these sort of ludicrous characters in mind, you start to see how vainglory in the simple sense starts to happen. When we take a little bit too much pride in something that doesn't really deserve that much praise at all. An easy one for husbands is, the one time they actually load the dishwasher, somehow they are caring, nurturing creatures who do everything for their wives. When in fact, it's just that they noticed that it was already halfway packed anyway. Might as well finish it off and hit the start button. So, vainglory, we look at these funny examples, but it's very small and easy to do. Now in this chapter, Smirak really brings up the heart of how vainglory can affect the church the most. When thinking about individuals, especially delusional people, it's really easy to sort of laugh at the person who calls himself an artist even though they're a tour guide. And as long as you're not married to these people or you're these people's parents, it's usually easy even to be their friends. You might get annoyed sometimes. You're like, hey Marv, I know you're not doing anything because you're unemployed. Please come pick me up from the airport. And they're like, no, I'm working on an artistic idea. Okay, that's annoying, but hey, at least you have a good story. Vainglory when it comes to entire groups of people, and that's when things start to look really bad. And Zmirak rightfully takes the church to task, that the church, because it is such a glorious thing and has such a glorious object, Christ itself and the worship of Christ, that it's very prone to do vainglory on a large scale. So he says, so far we've encountered less insidious and really ridiculous understandings of vainglory. He says the monks who listed this sin among the 7 deadly sins knew the human heart better than psychologists. And so even though we might have random examples of silliness, vainglory really starts to go more than just having a big head. You might start with a big head, with deluded perceptions about your own virtues or talents, but then you need to feed that head and keep up, like he says, pumping up the hot air. And that the lengths we will go to maintain an illusion is precisely when people get really dangerous. And the delusions oftentimes start with the best intentions of all. It might be that we're happy to help deliver babies, for instance, as a doctor, because we love the babies, but when we learn to love what people say about the job we're doing, that's when we start slipping up. Teachers are great if they have enthusiasm for their kids, but if what they start worrying about is accolades, or how good people are doing for test scores, you start to see where this is all going. It's why sports stars will willingly take steroids. It's why people will willingly cheat. It's why I guess I should realize students should plagiarize sometimes, that instead of being humbled and saying, this is what I need to improve on, the vainglorious nature of our society says, no, I don't want to hear any criticism at all. Vainglory can, of course, operate on a grand scale, infecting nations, cultures, ideologies, etc. And it's one thing to say and to hold out a greatness of what your culture has actually done. I always point out that Americans will go down in history as making the best sports ever invented in history. But to act like everybody else must understand this or adopt your way of life is fed, not necessarily so much by sheer evil half the time. People will misunderstand sort of globalization, for instance. It's not necessarily that Americans are just sitting around thinking about how they can screw up cultures, but they have this great thing and they want everybody to have it. Vainglory is to take a little bit too much stock of yourself and not realize that not everything for you is for everyone else. So expansionist countries like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, which of course are the worst examples of things, but already show this out. They think that they're reinventing the world or saving the workers or making Russia into the Germany to the Third Reich. But even countries that are not so obviously evil are willing to go out and spread the wealth of the idea they think that they have. And the church, like I said, is prone to this. As soon as her members and her leaders neglect or betray the supernatural mission that the church has, and betrays it for something less than the supernatural. And the church has been powerful for so many years, and it's done so many great things for people. It invents hospitals, it gives art, it does all sorts of things. But American churches in particular have reaped the lesson of vainglory in the church, most recently with the sex abuse crisis that reached its head in the late 90s and the early 2000s. People will come up with all sorts of reasons they want to assign for this, that, and the other about the church, and why it could fall so easily into this trap. But all you have to do is look at someone like Philip Lawler's book, The Faithful Departed, The Collapse of Boston's Catholic Culture. It's a really hard-nosed, sad book, but an honest book, to look about why vainglory sets up the most horrible, easily avoidable evils. In America, of course, Catholicism, first comes over with the Spanish and everyone else, but by the time you're talking about the 19th century, Catholicism comes over via immigrants, and particularly Irish, Italian immigrants. That's what we mostly have in mind when we're talking, but various other immigrants as well. Out in Kansas, it's the German immigrants, of course. And the 1850s is when this caps off, but at the beginning there is quite a bit of direct persecution of the Catholic immigrants. You just need to go watch Gangs of New York to get a sort of ready testament of this. Not all of the scenes, some of them are naughty, but get the point anyway. So nativist riots against Irish in New York, making them second-class citizens, etc. And it's one of those deals where Christianity and Catholicism, wherever it goes, can find itself being the most beaten down subculture of a civilization, only to find itself eventually work its way into the upper class and actually be the trendsetters for the culture at large. And if you think about how long it takes from the Irish coming over in waves to when an Irish Catholic president is elected with John F. Kennedy, at most, 150-year span, that's almost like watching civilization on fast forward. As someone says, it's like American Irish went from living in the catacombs to ruling the roost in less than 150 years. This is how even someone like Evelyn Waugh, who is a cantankerous sort of person, can talk about the coming American era in the Catholic Church circa 1950. The apex of this influence was the Cold War anti-communist years, 1960, that Catholics really saw themselves on the verge of assuming the mantle as America's new leadership. You have the Kennedys. You go look at the robustness of professors that were Roman Catholic in different universities, especially in something like philosophy or political thought. It's almost stunning about how a group of people literally seen as second-class citizens 100 years ago were almost ready to take the wheel of America at large. What we know is within those years and subsequent to those, we see what we're living with now in the ruins of established American Catholicism. We see the places where people were most Catholic are sometimes the least Catholic now. We see actually a sort of turning where it's not northeastern cities, but southern converts that make up the majority of active and participatory Catholicism. And of course, we've had to live through the sickening and sad reports about how many of the bishops in certain aspects of the Catholic Church throughout that time relented on their duty to keep up, the children of their diocese safe. Now, this isn't the place to go into all of the numerical details and things like this, and I'd be the first to point to many articles that it's within American media's interest to overplay how many American priests, for instance, were ultimately accused of sexual abuse. All the sort of motives to attack so hard on the Catholic Church when actually this is a problem our society faces in general. I'm getting sick and tired of reading every day in the news about how some teacher has sexually abused some child who's under their purvue, under their guard, and how many times this is actually women doing it to younger children that they're responsible for. So this is a wretched cultural problem, and the Catholic Church unfortunately looked like the rest of the culture, but that's exactly the problem. That the Catholic Church itself found itself looking like the rest of the culture is exactly the crux of the issue. We who, with Christ, are supposed to lead culture away from these things, so oftentimes find ourselves not uniquely the problems of the world, but mired in the problems of the world. Be that the late 20th century church in America, for what we're talking about with the sexual abuse cases, whether that be the Borgia family and Italian pre-mafia politics, be it this, that, or the other thing that we can point to in the church, where the problem with the church is not that she uniquely does anything wrong. In fact, nearly any book that acts like Catholicism uniquely causes some problem in the world almost essentially can be proven wrong. The problem is how often the Catholic Church will just look like everyone else. But this is not to say that the Catholic Church, this is because it's not real, or it doesn't have its stuff together, or it's went astray as an institution. It will make sense that if vainglory creeps into the church, the reason the church will look like the rest of the world is because vainglory impels us to look like the rest of the world. Vainglory, glorifying in nothing, will of course be concerned precisely with the world and what the world thinks of her. The church, when it is led by vainglorious people, is often going to share in the problems of the world in which it is trying to impress. And it is just the same with people who are vainglorious in their individual selves. There's always some play acting that the vainglorious person or the vainglorious institution is willing to do, and in doing so neglects the reality that cannot be neglected, that should not be neglected, and that ultimately demonstrates the need for the church to always rely on its supernatural, grace-filled part. Father George Rutler puts this whole thing in a very interesting way in contemplating Pontius Pilate. And since this is coming up on Friday, I think this is good to read in full. So he's talking about when Pilate washes his hands and allows Jesus to go be killed. Pilate washes his hands, the ultimate gesture of contempt for people outside, and in the final analysis, the ultimate gesture of contempt for himself. If there are patron saints, there must be patron sinners as well. And Pontius Pilate is the patron of proud public figures, it's a lot of alliteration, who will not impose their personal morality on anyone else, even when it means the destruction of innocent life by the consent of silence. He has a career, and he's getting along pretty well, and that's what seemed to count then, too. So the delusion of vainglory can go both ways. It can make individuals play act and never grow up. But it can also make people in positions of power act only too adult, if you will, right? I can't live by ideals like justice. I have a job. I have, a family at home. I can't go against the church. I can't go against the prevailing times. I can't do this. I can't do that. The delusion goes both ways. And in both cases, vainglory takes pride in something that's not there. In the delusional individual who thinks they're, a princess or a cowboy, an astronaut when they're, 35 years old and they work at TGIFs, what they're missing is this idea of taking pride in something that is not there or only in their imagination. But the flip side, when there's the Pontius Pilate type move, that like my hands are tied, I wash my hands of situations, you take glory in something that does not actually exist, which is that any sort of position can be more important than the reality on the ground of how we act towards other people. So like Zmirak says, if we look at the church and we're willing to talk about the church's sins and ask forgiveness of them because as Christ has triumphed over the whole world, we don't need to defend the errors of the people who have filled the pews of the churches throughout time. We can be honest about these things and learn from their mistakes. The problem doesn't boil down, whether it be, he's talking about the sex abuse crisis here. So he says the problem doesn't boil down to birth control, modernist theology, or fuzzy documents of Vatican II, or whatever people want to say. We can't blame it all on psychiatrists, Freemasons, or nuns with tambourines. We go throughout time, we can't blame it on Italian popes, or Borgia, or the mob, or the fact that, Catholics liked reading this, that, or the other, or whatever things we want to throw out. To look there is to miss what is actually at root, is to diagnose symptoms as the problems when it does not go deep enough. The illness that infected all of them, as what Jacques Maritain calls kneeling before the world. Kneeling before the world, the worst form of vainglory. Because the world, of course, bestows no real honors. And the world, of course, will go away and pass away. To kneel before the world is to kneel before a mirage at best, or to kneel before our image of ourselves. It's this very inverse pride that keeps falling back on itself. So we kneel before the world, hoping that the world will kneel before us. Spiritual directors used to call this craving the sin of human respect. And this is another name for vainglory. Now, ending on that note about vainglory would of course depress anyone, and if I left you there, I'd say, now go be depressed. Have a nice day. But the reason vainglory is so obvious in the church when it happens is, of course, the entirety of the church is founded off of the virtue counter vainglory, which is humility. If there's anything that you want to lead off in talking about Christ, it's that to oppose the superbia of humans and angels that were created by God but found themselves too good to serve Him. If there's anything you want to oppose the vainglory of people who glory in things that do not actually exist, we counter with Christ, who was not afraid to humble Himself although He had everything. Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, the true second person of the Trinity, who deserves all glory forever and ever, as Paul says in Philippians, did not count it as above Himself to lower Himself, taking on the form of a slave to become like us. The word... that was turned off. The word in Greek, Greek is kenosis. I actually messed this up last time I was talking about it, so sorry video camera if you remember. Kenosis means self-emptying. And Christ, in His kenosis... And notice that Christ is not just... of course Christ is humble when He's willing to go on the cross and die for our sins. But realize that Christ, from the very beginning of His incarnation, willingly empties Himself. And so already, in simply becoming a man born of the Virgin Mary on Christmas, Christ already is kenosis itself, the self-emptying of a God who would take on humanity to be with us. Because God is complete in God's self and God in Himself. God doesn't need to sort of I'm going to put on some human flesh and cruise around and figure stuff out. God knows what it's like to be human because God created us. God adds nothing to Himself by becoming a man. All He does is empty Himself. Now, of course, He doesn't cease to be God, but He puts Himself on the constraints that we live with. He's born, He's little, He has to grow up, He skins His knee, He has bad food, He probably has allergies that make His left eye all act weird. Sorry if my eyes are bugging you out. Jesus Christ in His sheer existence is humility. And Jesus Christ in His passion and death is pure humility, the emptying of Himself unto death to take the punishment that we deserve. Even in His resurrection, Christ is self-emptying. You would think that if Christ died on the cross and had to deal with us, He'd be perfectly vindicated if He's like, you know what, I'm just heading back home, forget you guys. You guys all suck. You're mean. I'm done. And you'd go like, well, by sheer justice, don't see why Christ owes us anymore. And here I'm being wacky, speculative theologian, and I probably should since I'm being taped. But you could imagine that Christ just dies for us on the cross, and that's it. He goes down to hell, but after that He's like, okay, I'm done being incarnated. I've paid your debt. And then we get to start over. But of course, Christ, knowing that we would just mess up again, Christ empties Himself further and is resurrected and comes back. And the assumption into heaven even shows a kenosis that God will never leave His attachment to the human reality. Jesus Christ will always be incarnate. He assumed himself into heaven. He's always emptied himself out to us. In the church itself, founded on the cross, when Jesus gives St. John to Mary and Mary to St. John, the church herself is founded in this self-emptying, this kenosis, this giving away. It's the body of Christ given to us. The Eucharist is humility. Abba Cecile of the Salim congregation, she puts it best, what ethics is for Christians is to imitate Christ in the Eucharist. And that means to be always and willingly available to give ourselves away at any cost. And if we can imitate that, then we will become like our Lord. Jesus Christ says he will be with us always, and in the sacraments, he's always there. And if we want to be horrible, saturnial SOBs, we can go to Christ every Mass and abuse him more and take him unworthily. We can blaspheme him. We can do horrible things to the Eucharist. And it just stands as a ready possibility. And Christ said, I'll do it for us, for you. Christ, even now in heaven through the sacraments, is kenosis, is self-emptying, is humility itself. He lets men, of course, priests that he ordains, but he lets them at their beck and call him to the altar to be given away. Jesus, you could have said, look, I'll be at the altar every day at 3 o'clock. You better be there. If you're late, I won't show up. But he ordained human beings and said, at your command, you will confect me in the Eucharist, and I will come. I will do this for you. I will do this for you. And so Jesus Christ, who can glory in himself and should be glorified, never does. And in a glory that he really has and really deserves, he only takes that glory as one more day, one more opportunity, one more minute to empty himself back for our good. So humility is the basic way that we fight the delusion of the world and enter into reality most in two ways. For one thing, we need to be humble because we're not all that, bro. We're not. We have problems. We screw things up. Our left eye acts all crazy when allergies start. We start late. We get to Mass late. We don't wake up. We don't keep promises. We forget things. Even at our best, we're not hitting on all 6 cylinders. We're not 100%. Oh, and by the way, we all die someday. So, just on that level, reality is a humility. A humility. We depend on everything that we get. In fact, philosophy itself, the study of what things really are, is best described as a humility. We don't impose ourselves on the world. The world is constantly imposing itself on us. You come into the world as a baby, and sure, you make a lot of noise and you might keep people up at night, but from day one, the world is giving itself to you. It's giving itself to you. And to learn is to learn to be humble, to learn to understand ourselves as the thing in which the world enwraps us and gives us all that we need, all that we can be, and any knowledge that we have. So in a natural way, humility is the point of life. And to vainly glory, to act like I've created the world, I've established my own life, I can be proud of who I am without reserve, is ridiculous. Anybody who ever gets too proud, ask them when they invented the English language they're currently speaking, or the air that they're currently breathing, or, you get my point. The other way in which humility is the fact of reality is that nothing is more real than Jesus Christ. I think Father David Longenecker on his blog made this really interesting point. He said when we talk about the real presence of the Eucharist, everybody's very worried about the presence. We should be. That's a big deal. We're arguing Christ is really there. But he likes to focus on the real in real presence. Because the Eucharist is more real than every other aspect of our life. Christ, the form, the Word through which all things are created, is reality. Is reality personified and reality spread throughout the cosmos. So when we talk about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, it's not only that He's present, but reality sort of jam-packed, if you will. Reality condensed. Reality in a node sitting there right there that we get to participate into. So if Christ is humility itself, is kenosis itself, then reality is humility like Him. To be like Christ is to be more real, to be what we are called to be. So Thomas in the Summa Theologica says, humility has essentially to do with the appetite insofar as a man restrains the impetuosity of his soul from tending inordinately to great things. So in other words, humility backs away our appetite for praise, and it makes it appropriate and proportionate. Yet its rule is in the cognitive faculty, and that we should not deem ourselves to be above what we are. Also, the principle and origin of both these things is the reverence we bear to God. So we have appetites, we want to eat, we want to drink, we want people to like us, and we want to be praised. And yet again, the theme of all these things, this isn't an entirely inherent negative thing. Part of our willingness and hope to be praised is what makes us social animals that actually love each other. Very early on, I think children, their first understanding of love is when their mom and their dad take pride in them and love them and say, "You're neato, kid," or I shake my kids' hands. I don't hug them or kiss them. I just, okay. No, exactly. It's like when the kid does anything at all, you've seen that, right? You've seen the mother who has a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old accidentally wipes up milk off the table because they happen to have a napkin in their hand. And everyone goes in ecstatic jubilation. "Oh, Jimmy helped clean up. Good job, Jimmy. Let's hang a banner for Jimmy. Let's call it Jimmy Day. Thank you, Jimmy." And if you're not a parent, this seems like, oh, come on. I can clean too. Praise me. But of course, we do this, because we want the kid to learn to like cleaning because we know that day's passing away at some point. But we also do this because we're social animals. And the reason it's nice to pay compliments to people is not to make them vainglorious, but to say, "I like you being around. I think we're better this way. I'm glad we're not mountain lions." Mountain lions don't give out many compliments. They don't see each other too much. So just like hunger or thirst or the sexual appetite is not evil in itself, it's only its disproportionate realization. The yearning for praise, the yearning for understanding that we're capable of great things is not in and of itself evil. Rendered with superbia, it becomes vainglory, becomes the seeking of things that we don't deserve and that we don't need. In other words, humility means we train our minds to stay scrupulously, there's all sorts of words today we're doing that I can't say, scrupulously truthful to the nature of our own attainments and place in the world, erring where necessary on the side of self-demotion, if only to counteract the fallen human tendency to glory in vain. It is not for us to hate ourselves. And the church does not talk about humiliation to make pusillanimous people who, where does he put this? I've missed this part. He has this great way of talking about what pusillanimity is. Oh, right, here you go. St. Thomas teaches that it's wrong for us to practice humility when it tempts others to sin. When it tempts others to sin. That means that accepting abuse and resigning yourself needlessly to suffering, needlessly in suffering and injustice, in fact might be unchristian. Today, we call that enabling. And so, where do we mark the line off? I don't know. Part of it happens to be manners. Depends on where you're from. In Oklahoma, self-deprecating jokes. It's a nice icebreaker. So I remember all of my uncles and grandparents doing that sort of stuff. Teasing was sort of a way to just, lubricate social relationships. And then when us sarcastic 30-somethings got old enough to do it ourselves, we would self-deprecate by being ironically proud. Like, oh, you're lucky to be here because I'm here. And everyone jokes, no way. So, part of it is just, how cultures and civilizations do these sort of things. But when we allow ourselves to be the occasion of someone's sin, we're pusillanimous. And that's why pusillanimity has a context of cowardice. That's why Pontius Pilate is pusillanimous. First of all, because obviously we were supposed to say the sound P a lot today, because we've alliterated the P sound like 5,000 times in this lecture. But also because the impulse to wash our hands, to act, like that's what Pilate was doing. He's like, see, no, this isn't my realm. I'm not going to be proud and act like I should decide what should happen to Jesus. And you're like, no, precisely, it's your job. You're the ruler. Buck up and make a decision. And you see this with parents too, right? It's not my job to tell my kids how to live their life. And what they're really saying is, I'm too scared my kid might not like me for a day or an hour. And humility is often bent the other way by that exact feeling. So although we started off talking about how sad it can be when the greatest things, like the church, fall into vainglory, I hope that we ended pointing in the right direction for Triduum. Because Triduum, of all things, even more than Christmas, shows the kenosis of Christ, his ever-willingness to give himself away. First by establishing the Eucharist, then in the great sacrifice of Good Friday, his willingness to scourge hell, and then his willingness even to rise from the dead as a kenosis. And that humility, St. Thomas says that it's what does he say? It's underneath temperance. And of course, temperance we've talked about is utilizing things correctly. And humility is basically utilizing ourselves correctly, understanding ourselves correctly, understanding our place in the world correctly. And if God himself can give himself away like Christ, truly we can give ourselves away as well. And what's noble and actually magnanimous about the Catholic faith is if we look at Christ, we should fill up with the sort of magnanimous pride that as human beings, we are capable of giving our way so grandly. It's not a matter of hating everything we do. It's a matter of glorying in the glory Christ has given the human person. We truly do deserve to give glory to Mary and the saints and the people in our lives who truly are heroes or role models. But the only glory they deserve is the glory in so much as they match Christ in his giving himself away. There is a nobility to all of that. The Catholic faith is not about making everybody feel bad by the fact that we merely exist. It's simply, where do we focus the glory? We can either glory in nothingness, in delusion, or in the world that really is not there. Or we can glory in Christ and the many places in which Christ plays throughout the world, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says. So I wish all of you a blessed Triduum, and I hope that the graces of the Triduum really seep into your hearts and help us to avoid all the things that we've talked about this year that we need to avoid, and bring you further in the virtues. So, thank you.